Good morning. I am the fall leaf today, um, as usual. Um, no, actually, it's better without. Thank you, though. Yes, I know I'm live. I'm thinking. I'm surprised you can't hear the tumblers clicking. This was not something I'd planned to say this morning, but I shared it with Carol, and then it dawned on me why these little things had happened, and I have to think that they have something to do with the fact that I get to speak this morning. Last night, I was going to sit down at my computer desk to work on my talk, and I reached out to turn on the lamp that's on the computer desk, and it didn't turn on. So I made sure the bulb was screwed in tightly. Then I changed the bulb. Nothing happened. Now I realized the lamp was probably dead when I got there, but still, it seemed a little odd. Lamps don't usually die, at least not in my experience, or at least not until I touch them. Then I went in the kitchen, and I have a little lamp on my stove that I use for a nightlight. Reached out to turn it on, and the bulb blew. Okay, so I replaced the bulb, not a terribly big deal. But in my experience, and I realize this may be a self-fulfilling prophecy, things kind of do happen in threes. And I thought, okay, what else is going to happen tonight? So I went upstairs, got ready to read for a while as I was getting ready for bed. And as I went to put on my reading glasses, the earpiece on this side came off. And then I felt a little tiny plop on my lap, and the little screw landed there. So I retrieved it and tried for about 10 minutes to fix it. And I don't think that any average human being can do that. It's just too small. And so, three little things. But as I was telling Carol about it this morning, what occurred to me is that all three of those, light and glasses and so forth, have to do with being able to see more clearly. So that was my little lesson for this morning. So sacred text today is from Mike Dooley. This is someone that Carol and I both follow. He sends out an email daily, Monday through Friday. And actually last year sometime when we were still meeting, I spoke based on a book of his. Excuse me one second. Here we go. If it has appeared on your life's radar, this is why. To teach you that dreams come true, to reveal that you have the power to fix what's broken and heal what hurts, to catapult you beyond seeing with just your physical senses, and to lift the veils that have kept you from seeing that you've already become the person you dreamed you would become. And I had some concerns about presenting this topic because I seem to be drawn to the topics that I think are difficult to talk about. A number of years ago, I talked about gay marriage, and I really, even in our congregation, I wasn't sure about what kind of reception I was going to find. I've talked about the rights of animals, and in not nearly the detail that I would like to, because I don't want to really horrify people. And what I'm going to talk about today, loosely, is the police force. And the reason that has come up as a topic, obviously, is because last summer in Minneapolis, where I used to live, in an area where I have been, just off of Lake Street, a man named George Floyd died horribly. And since then, the police have come under terrible criticism and terrible fire. And I have just been thinking about all the ramifications of that. And so where I want to start is to give you a little information, and you may already be familiar with something called white privilege. And I'm going to speak in some generalities today, because I don't have time to, pick everything apart. I'm going to assume, looking at the screen and seeing who's here, that as far as I know, all of my listeners today are Caucasian. And I know we are all mixed bags. I'm a mixed bag, but I'm still very white. So having said that, assuming that I'm speaking to a white audience, white privilege is the societal privilege that benefits white people over non-white people in some societies, for example, our own, particularly if they are otherwise under the same social, political, or economic circumstances. With roots in European colonialism and imperialism and the Atlantic slave trade, white privilege has developed in circumstances that have broadly sought to protect white racial privileges, various national citizenships, and other rights or special benefits. White privilege assures advantages that whites in Western societies enjoy and not whites do not experience as an, quotes, invisible package of unearned assets, end quote, an invisible package of unearned assets. The concept of white privilege also implies the right to assume the universality of one's own experiences, marking others as different or unusual while perceiving oneself as normal. White privilege denotes both obvious and less obvious advantages that white people may not recognize they have. And here are, to me, in this last paragraph, the two most important pieces. Assuming the universality of one's own experiences, in other words, projecting our values and beliefs on others and finding them lesser or wrong or bad, and advantages that white people may not recognize they have. I think that, unfortunately, a lot of folks in our country don't recognize white privilege. They don't know that it exists. Or if there is an inkling that it might, they really don't want to believe it. They want to believe that, everything is good just the way it is. Now, we know that there are many, many ways in which white privilege is applied in our daily lives and, in the past. Few examples that I want to mention. And at this point, I'm very grateful for many of the eye-opening experiences that I had when I was in graduate school at UMD about 12 years ago. You cannot leave a social work graduate program without having your eyes opened to your privilege as a white person. In that program, in terms of working with a disadvantaged group, since we have, a reservation outside of Cloquet, we learned a fair amount, as much as an outsider can, about American Indian families, and particularly the hardships that they had faced. And I don't know if you know this, but starting in the late 1800s until as late as about 1960, American Indian children were taken forcibly from their families and put in boarding schools. And ostensibly, the purpose was to educate the children in a way that, white culture thought would benefit them. They were going to be trained, all of them, to be servants of one kind or another, whether it was the girls to go into house service or the boys to become, grooms or later, drivers, whatever. It was all about service. And again, whether the people doing this, and some of it was from the church, some of it was from the state, whether they realized it, what they were really accomplishing was destroying American Indian culture and families, because if the children don't learn the culture, it's gone. And as a matter of fact, about 15 years ago, I dated a man briefly who is my age, who was one of the last people in his generation. He was one of the last kids in a boarding school. And he'd grown up in Oregon, and he ended up in boarding school because his mother was Native, his father was white. When his mother died of cancer, rather than allowing the dad to decide how he wanted to deal with his two children, they were taken from him and put in boarding school. It was not a good situation, not a good experience. I imagine we all know that Japanese Americans were interned during World War II. That means that they were forcibly taken from their homes. These were American citizens. These were not recent immigrants. They were taken from their home based on our fear, our racism, pardon me, put on, in camps and forced to stay there until the war was over. I don't know that any apology or reparation has ever been made. It's possible that it has, but it's just kind of one of those things that we've swept under the rug. And right now, and this is why I have a tissue handy. Right now, Latino children are in prisons on the southern border of our country. They and their families came looking for asylum. And because our current administration, well, and frankly, many other people in our country are afraid of people who don't look like them or us. I do not understand, and I haven't looked into it deeply, I don't understand why the children are separated from their parents. Unless, again, it's that subconscious, let's separate the children so they don't learn, more about the culture from these, invading people. For nearly 4 years, right around 2000, I lived in North Dakota because my husband at the time got a job in the computer field. So we took off. I was lucky enough to get 2 jobs, both working with children, which is some kind of irony since I have spoken before about the fact that children, let's put it nicely, children challenge me. There, I'll acknowledge that. And I did not know that there was a large Latino population in this area because they are migrant farm workers. And some of the folks have settled down and stay around. Many of the folks travel back and forth to Texas. Texas is their home state. North Dakota is a hugely agricultural state, but it's very sparsely populated. If it were not for migrant farm workers, those crops would not get planted, taken care of, harvested, and so on and so forth. So here's a weird situation in this community. The farmers certainly realize that they need the migrant workers so that they can, raise their crops, harvest them, make a living, so on and so forth. So you would think that the surrounding community would understand that too. And here's the tension. I remember one time going to a garage sale, like that kind of stuff. And and we were waiting in line to get in, and I heard someone refer to dirty Mexicans. That attitude was not at all uncommon. And yet these are the folks who came to make life in this community possible. The deliberate blindness is astonishing. One of the things that made slavery, the taking of African folks from their homes and forcibly, brought to this country to work in the fields. Well, it's something that's made slavery possible because, of course, slavery of one kind or another has actually been around for millennia. When we say slavery, we usually mean the slavery in the Deep South, the pre-Civil War. It was very handy for the folks who wanted slaves, and I'm talking about our history now, to refer to African folks as, certainly other, but as savages and lesser than, certainly lesser than. There had to be some kind of psychological reasoning that would allow for other people to be enslaved, raped, beaten, killed, sold. Here's another piece of irony. The slave owners made it known to the people they owned that they could not learn to read or write on pain of death. Now, certainly if the slaves could learn to read or write, they had a very a mental capacity that was close to that of the slave owners. But as I have read, the main reason that they were forbidden from doing that was the slave owners were very concerned that they would communicate with slaves on other plantations, maybe even in different states, maybe even abolitionists in the North, and they were afraid of an uprising. They knew, of course, they knew that they were enslaving intelligent, feeling people. But they had to come up with some very false, ugly reasoning for this oppression. Okay, eventually I have to bring this back to the police, so I'm going to start heading that way now. As some of you know, I worked at an assisted living facility for quite some time until COVID hit last spring. I stayed for a while. I didn't feel safe. I left. Not too long before I left, I agreed to work an overnight shift. And other than staying awake, overnights are kind of cool because it's really quiet. And for an introvert, not having to deal with a lot of other people is really okay. And within reason, we were allowed to do pretty much anything, to help stay awake. We could read, knit, watch TV, I would get up and walk laps in a limited area. Anyway, what I found worked best for me was finding something on television that, that had a plot to stay with. So comedy didn't work very well. Dramas worked better, plot, so on and so forth. So that particular night, and as you can imagine, very slim pickings in the middle of the night, what I found, the only thing I found that I thought might do the trick, were reruns of a TV show that I'd never seen before called Chicago PD. And of course, as you can tell, it follows members of a unit in the Chicago Police Department. And of course, they're fighting crime. And, they are portrayed as, as decent people. And certainly they make mistakes. The bad guys were a mixture of white, black, Latino, spread around. And so I think it's very interesting in a non-coincidental way in my life that I was exposed to this police procedural, which I've kind of been watching off and on ever since. And then the death of George Floyd came along. And so there's been this weird confluence of how I have become aware of the police and how I look at them. And this is what has occurred to me that I want to share with you. If we think about our white privilege and how much we don't want to be faced with the oppression that exists in our country, the way that people are totally disempowered, disadvantaged, and that we are not doing something for the most part to change that. To me, that means that we employ the police to help protect us from not only the actual crime, but from having to see or be aware of the results of the oppression that exist in our country. We pay the police to protect our property and our feelings and our sensibilities. The police are doing exactly what we have asked them to do. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that any of us would have asked any officer to kill an African American person. And yet somehow or another, the fear is so great that that's what is happening. Why do we have increased fear? Because there's increased unrest, because people are finding their voices. And something that occurred to me the other day, as I mentioned, I know the area of Minneapolis where the riots took place. And I got this sudden sort of rush. It's like it's hard to understand probably why people riot. And yet, if you've been oppressed and felt marginalized or excluded for all of your life, and suddenly there's a spark, literal spark that goes off, in this case from the murder of someone in that community, I imagine that the power that you would feel from letting your rage burst forth would be absolutely exhilarating. rage bursts forth. It cannot be held down forever. And that's what we need to be looking at and to be dealing with. One other point I want to make, when I was in graduate school, we had a speaker. There was some day-long conference, and this was a guy, white like us, a guy who had grown up in Wisconsin. And he had discovered that the land that his family home stood on was originally native land. And where and how it had become white land, the specifics were not clear. And of course, even if there had been a treaty in which the lands had been ceded, most treaties were violated by our government anyway. His point was that if in any way we have benefited from the losses of other people, particularly racial minorities, whether they were the indigenous people of this country, the slaves who were forcefully brought to this country, I'm sure there are many other ways. Even the Japanese Americans who were interned during World War II, we benefited from their discomfort because we felt safer. His point, which I think is something to consider seriously, is that if we benefit from the exploitation of another person or group, we might want to consider how we can make reparations. And that's a topic for next week. I'm going to take a really quick look at my notes and make sure I've covered what I want to today. In this morning's paper, I look at the Duluth paper online in the morning. I saw that a new historical marker has been put up across the street from the Clayton Jackson McGee Memorial. And one of the things it says, and I didn't copy and paste it to read here, you can find it in the paper if you choose. It mentions the fact that lynchings, such as the ones that happened here in 1902, or I'm sorry, I don't remember exactly when it was, that from 1877 until 1950, that lynchings were a very, very common form of what they called racial terrorism. And I imagine that after the end of the Civil War, as African-American folks began to move forward into populated areas, people were not real happy, and there was a lot of, ugliness and retaliation. I'm going to throw a cliche at you because cliches always hold a lot of truth. And at this point, the one I want to throw at you is that given, and I hope you feel as I do, that the reason we need to pay attention to this is a spiritual crisis. This is not, it is a political crisis, but it's not merely a political crisis. It's not merely a social crisis. This is a spiritual crisis. If we know that people are being treated badly, if we know and we do nothing, then we come to the cliche. If you are not part of the solution, you are part of the problem. And that is why I wanted to bring this to our attention today, so that we can step up if we choose to. And I hope we choose to. In the article about the new historical marker, there were comments from Emily Larson, who is our mayor. And I know Emily Larson. We were in the same grad program at UMD, and I like Emily Larson. And she went so far as to say, I acknowledge my responsibility for where we are today, my personal responsibility. And whenever we do that, it doesn't mean that we've, thrown a rock at someone. It means that we have passively participated in supporting the status quo. And so, as I conclude, what I want to say, it has not been my intent today to make you or any of us feel like a bad person. That's pointless and would be absolutely contrary to what I've been trying to say today. However, if you are uncomfortable in a way that you were not before, I'm okay with that, because comfortable people are usually complacent people, and they don't do a whole lot. If you're uncomfortable about something, you're far more likely to consider how you can be helpful. In other words, today I'm the rock in your shoe. You're not going to go very far with a rock in your shoe. And you can decide what you would like to do from this point forward. Now, the reason I divided this into two parts is that I do have some ideas to share with you about what we can be doing, both individually and as a group. And I'm sure you can think of some of those too. But where I will be coming from next week is all from a spiritual perspective. And so I hope this resonates with you in some way, hopefully deeply. If you're already on this page, as in, awareness, awesome. We can move forward more quickly and easily together. So enjoy the leaves, enjoy our beautiful climate. I'm particularly enjoying the Mount Ash tree in my backyard, where the red leaves are slowly being surrounded by golden leaves. It's just gorgeous. We are so amazingly lucky. And so I thank you for listening. It's been wonderful to see you this morning, and I look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you.